When one of your battalions has a company decisively engaged and outnumbered 10 to 1, at what point should a task force commander designate a reserve and coordinate the reinforcement of that company in contact? We look at logistics and C2 in the Battle of Long Tan with Harry Smith.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 57 of the Principles of War podcast, the Battle of Long Tan, logistics and C2 issues. This is the fourth of our podcast episodes with Lieutenant Colonel Harry Smith, who was the OC of Delta Company during the Battle of Long Tan. And one thing I would ask you to do is, as you are listening to this, think about the job of the OC who's trying to fight the battle, currently decisively engaged, and think about the role that battalion headquarters has to play in this, and also task force headquarters. What is their role in this battle? And how well do you think they played their respective roles? So this interview, it's with Harry Smith. So obviously he's talking about it from the OC's perspective, but he is in the thick of it. He's got a lot going on, and this is the point where those higher headquarters can really value add to the engagement and allow Harry to carry on and fight the battle as he needs to. Let's get right back into it. How about resupply? So what would you have gone out with? It wouldn't have been, each man wouldn't have had a huge number of rounds on them, would they?
There's always been a nonsense over this. People saying we only had 60 rounds per man. We had, with the weapons that we were given by 1 RAR, and we took over from, they were up at Benoit, and we got all their weapons. I mean, the Armalite and SLRs and so forth. And we only got 3 magazines per SLR, so that's 60 rounds. But every man had boxes, cardboard cartons of extra bullets. And, you know, in the average, they carried over 100, 120 rounds per man. Problem was, in the pouring monsoon rain, trying to reload magazines from wet cardboard boxes on the ground, not easy.
Yep.
After Long Tan, all ammunition was resupplied in magazines, and I think soldiers probably carried 5, 6 round ammunition magazines.
And so how did you go? Well, actually, just talking about the weapons, how did you find the individual weapons, or how did the company find the individual weapons? Which ones performed well, did you find?
Well, the SLR, FN, the Australian-made SLR, is an outstanding rifle, and always has been. The Armalites were ones handed down from one battalion. Were used. We didn't get cleaning rods with them, so if you got an a separate case, you couldn't get it out. So there were problems with spare parts and so forth. But those that worked all right seemed to work very well. And then later on, when I remember after the battle, I had to go up to Saigon, and I was interviewed by General Mackay, the commander of Army Force Vietnam, and he said, "How did you find the Owen?" And I said, "Of little use in the rubber, because its rounds are not potent enough to go through webbing at 50 yards." And he said, "What do you want?" And I said, "Pardon me." I said, "Give the Armalites to drivers down at Vung Tau and get us." So I give the Owens down to Vung Tau and get us Armalites, which is the best light weapon you can get to put under your arm while you're reading a map or doing something else, mainly for platoon commanders and section commanders. And he did, and we got brand new ones, and yeah, they were pretty good. I had no problems. The M60 had a few problems in that it didn't have an ammunition carrier, and like it's supposed to have, and it does have these days, an ammunition box where the belt is kept out of the dirt. But in our case, the soldiers carried the belts around their necks like Pancho Villa style, and they got dirt on them, and we had a lot of trouble with faulty ammunition, dirty ammunition clogging up the M60s. Those that fired well, I think. However, because of the ammunition problems, we had only about half the M60s who had firing at the end of the battle.
Which is a significant loss of firepower for you when you're in a defensive battle like that.
Yeah.
And I think I read a quote, I think it was from you, that you would have much preferred the old Vickers.
Well, yeah, but, you couldn't have the Vickers. Well, it was man-carried in New Guinea. There's no reason why we couldn't have man-carried, but the problem with it was there was no 7.62 Vickers. It was all 303, so we couldn't have it because of the ammunition compatibility with rifles, because we had 7.62 FMs, yeah.
How did you go organising resupply for ammunition then? As you started to realise that you're in a significant contact, obviously resupply was going to become important. How was that organised?
Well, I just radioed back to base to send out a resupply of ammunition and drop it headquarters at such and such big reference. And we were lucky in that there were 2 helicopters up at Nui Dat from Vung Tau with the concert party, Little Coldjoy and Little Paddy. So those 2 pilots were able to go to 6th Battalion LZ, pick up boxes of ammunition and bring them out to us.
You're right.
There were problems with the Air Force. I wasn't aware at that time that the Air Force had a embargo on helicopters flying in dangerous areas. So there was much discussion back at Task Force as to whether the choppers could come out or not, but eventually we went out. Pardon me, I have it on good authority with Frank Wiley, the leading pilot. Pardon me, Frank Wiley, who was the leading helicopter pilot, said, Harry Smith wants ammunition, we're going. And Bob Grandin was the other pilot. He said, well, I'll come along as well. So away they went. And they flew over to 6th Battalion. Owen O'Brien, who was admin OC, organised the ammunition to be loaded. It was still in banded boxes and so forth, but in fact, Owen O'Brien and the RSM and a couple of other people jumped on board the choppers as well. They pushed the boxes out right over my headquarters, and then Jack Kirby and Neil Rankin and a few others had to get the boxes off the machetes, or the boxes that were banded, cut open, and then strip it to the ammunition around to various soldiers. That was no mean feat.
While in contact.
After Longtown, all resupplies were in loaded magazines, not boxes.
The contact had been going on for a few hours now, and you weren't actually that far from Nui Dat. What was the process for reinforcements? Did you request that, or was that organised by the CO or ATF headquarters? Do you know?
When I realised that we were up against something more than we could handle, I spoke to the CO and I said, I need reinforcements, and sent them out by helicopter to where we met Bravo Company on the western edge of the rubber. And he said, we can't do that. And he came back to me and said, we'll send them out by armoured personnel carrier later in the afternoon. And that was the size of that. And then what happened was that Brigadier Jackson wouldn't allow the APCs with A Company, Alpha Company, on board, who had just arrived back in from a patrol, to move out, because he was worried that there was another BC regiment to the north that might come down and take on the base. The APCs were delayed at Nui Dat for something like an hour before they were able to leave to come out to us.
How was the battle progressing? So after the resupply, you're in the final company defensive position, and we're getting towards last light with quite a lot of rain coming down. What was the situation like then?
It was just a firefight. The enemy were attacking us. in waves. We'd bring in the artillery, and my own soldiers would shoot them down, and there's a process that went on. We were very lucky in that we were on a reverse slope, and that they couldn't fire into us unless they got right on top of the hill. So they were silhouetted against the background of smoke. And
What was the situation with reinforcements?
yeah, I had asked for reinforcements when I knew we were up against something more than we could handle, and I expected them to be flown out in helicopters, but I wasn't aware that the Brigadier had a thing in his mind that he didn't want to call upon the Americans, and our own RWS helicopters weren't allowed to fly into dangerous areas in those days. Consequently, when I asked for ammunition to come out in the helicopters, there was some discussion back at Task Force about whether Canberra had to be asked to get their approval. Well, that would have been 48 hours. But Frank Riley, who was the leading helicopter pilot, and the other pilot, Bob Grandin, said, Harry Smith wants ammunition, let's go. So they brought it out, which was good for them.
Exactly, and very timely. As far as the reinforcements, they took quite a while to marry up with the APCs to get out of the base. Do you know much of the story behind that?
Yes, well, we didn't have any other companies complete, as it were, to be able to move out. Bravo Company was half in Bungtao and a platoon out at Long Tan. Charlie Company were out on patrol somewhere or wherever, I'm not sure, but they weren't available to move. Bravo Company, Noel Ford's company, he had half in Bungtao and a platoon out at Long Tan, or on the outskirts.
Just after 11 Platoon became decisively engaged, the company started to receive indirect fire. How did you respond to that?
I held the rest of the company where we were to see what was going to happen. Not long after, there were sounds of mortars that pop, 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 pop from down south somewhere, and some 60mm mortars landed maybe 10 to 15 metres to our south. So I said to the other two platoons of the company, we'll get out of here, and we moved about 300 metres to the northeast. It so happened that where we stopped became our final defensive position, and it was on a reverse slope. And it meant that if anyone wanted to fire into us, they had to come right up to the top of the hill. Otherwise, they couldn't fire at us. And we were subject to fire from machine gun. They had on nearly that too hill, but not from the enemy assault troops until they got right up close to us, and by which time my soldiers could give them a hard time. And I think I said we fired 10,500 rounds of small arms ammunition at the enemy, plus 3,500 rounds of artillery, and that certainly took a toll. Eventually, the enemy withdrew. Were aware that the reinforcements that I asked for wouldn't come out in helicopters, are coming out in APCs, and the quote was later that afternoon. And they weren't allowed to leave because the Brigadier was worried that the other enemy regiment, which was known to be in the north, might come down and take on the Medevac base. But eventually I said a few words. I said, if they don't leave, they may as well not come because they won't be here before dark. And somebody must have said, okay, go. So A Company was mounted in the APCs. When the Brigadier finally allowed them to move, they moved out. There was a delay somewhere, I understand. They couldn't get out of the wire because the gate had been changed or something, and the APCs couldn't go through the wire because if they get the wire on their tracks, it would throw a track off the wheels. So they had to be careful with barbed wire. And they eventually left and went down to the south over a river crossing and came up about a kilometre south of us, and they ran into D445 local BC battalion and had a fight there, the right-hand carrier got involved with them, but they fled. And when the carriers moved on, and I didn't say that the CO hadn't joined up with the carriers before they left the base, so he wanted to be picked up. So they sent 2 carriers back to pick him up. Those 2 carriers finally arrived when the leading group were around about 300 metres south of our position. Another carrier had been sent back because the crew commander was mortally wounded, and that was sent back to base. And when they arrived to our south, the enemy had actually withdrawn. We didn't know on the day that they had withdrawn, but we now know that they had. I recall that Noel Ford and I were walking around wondering what the enemy were doing next. They're going to reorganise and come in from another area. But in fact, they had left and they had gone east. And the APCs saw them in the distance, chased them for about 500 metres, lost them in the dark, and turned around and they came back to us at 7:10 that night. And that was the end of the battle.
So an interesting question. What was happening with Bravo Company? They'd sent a couple of platoons back to Nui Dat, so that literally left the OC with 1 platoon and company headquarters. Where were they during the battle?
Oh, they were with me. Yeah, Noel Ford sent 2 platoons of his company back because they were supposed to go on leave down to our first lot of R&R, Western recreational leave or whatever they called it in those days, down to Vung Tau. But because they came out to Long Tan the day before, they didn't go, and he sent them back at dawn on the morning of the 18th. And we stayed at Long Tan to the west of the rubber waiting for us to arrive, and we didn't get there till lunchtime. We gave them lunch, and then he took off. He was about halfway back to Nui Dat. I called for him to come back to us. He wasn't allowed. He was told not to move by CO6OR. It wasn't until later when the Brigadier allowed the APCs to move that CO6OR allowed Bravo Company to come back to us.
Because they'd sort of been stuck out there for a number of hours after the contact started, weren't they?
Yeah, they had, yeah.
So after you marry up with the APCs, what were the next steps?
Well, when the APCs arrived, basically at dark, and they dropped off people in the carriers, which was A Company, Alpha Company, and they formed a screen to our east in case the enemy counterattacked, and they didn't. And we were prepared to stay there all night. But the CO at around about, I suppose, 9 o'clock said we are going to go back to the grass area on the west of the rubber, which is where we met up with Bravo Company. And Noel Ford, myself, and Charles Mollison, who was acting A Company commander, all said, we don't want to move. We're in a secure position. We've got artillery fire around us on DF task. Why do we move at night time? It's fraught with danger. We could be ambushed on the way back and be in big trouble. The commanding officer was rigid and said, we are going out. We may have been given orders by the Task Force Brigadier to get out of the rubber. We might see us take any more casualties. I don't know exactly what went on, but anyway, we went and we got out into the grass area and we sat there the night and waited for dawn.
So the next morning, Delta leads the battlefield clearance through the rubber plantation. Do you want to sort of tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, we were going to be joined by, I remember Brian McFarlane's Charlie Company to come out from Nui Dat in APCs, and we were hopefully going to leave and start going back to the east through the battlefield at dawn. But the APCs from the base, other people who were involved with them didn't arrive, and we couldn't leave until about 9 o'clock at the earliest. we just sat there and twiddled our thumbs and waited until everybody arrived, and we had all sorts of people arrive, from the general from Saigon, the task force commander, etc., because it was quite obvious that we'd had a fairly big battle and they wanted to see what had gone on. And anyway, when we got to go, we formed up and Delta Company led the column back into the rubber. We were in APCs, and I wanted to see what had happened to the soldiers we were missing. We had 15 missing, and we didn't know whether the enemy would have mutilated their bodies, as we'd been told it happened up north. So we wanted to get back in there, and when we arrived, we found 2 of the soldiers still alive. They had been left behind by the platoon when they got out, but they didn't know they were alive. One of them, Jimmy Richmond, was unconscious and bleeding, and they thought he was dead. And the other one was propped up against a tree somewhere, and he'd told his rescuers to leave him be and he'd hide, and so he stayed there all night. He claimed in an article published in the Australian Post that the enemy came up and took his boots, and that didn't happen, and we withdrew that later on. But anyway, those 2 were still alive, and the other 13 were dead. We took another 4 killed in the defensive position, which was pretty light, really, that we took some 24 wounded. But we got back into where we'd fought, and there were enemy bodies everywhere. I can still see the ground littered with enemy bodies, and we actually counted 245, and people will argue about that. They said, oh, nobody saw 245. Well, I didn't either. But each platoon counted their own, and Bob Buick tells me that he and a machine gunner, Private Detman, went around the area outside of Lytton, and they counted 185 bodies, and they put a branch, because there were plenty of branches lying around, artillery had blown the trees to pieces. They put a branch over the top of each one they counted, so they didn't get a double count. And Bob tells me they had 185 around the Lytton platoon, so to have 245 in the whole company there is not an exaggeration. And the next day we found a mass grave of 48 more, and I'm told later on by the training team advisors with the Arvin forces that they found other mass graves in the area leading out to where their home base was in the Nuenato Mountains, about 30 kilometres to the northeast. I'm pretty satisfied that the list that we found in 1969, or the battalion found on that second tour, 876 casualties, is pretty accurate.
We'll leave our interview there with Harry, and next week we'll return as he continues his discussion about the Battle of Long Tan from his perspective. If you're interested to learn more about the Battle of Long Tan from Harry's point of view, I would definitely recommend getting a copy of the Battle of Long Tan, the company commander's story. Not only does it go into a great amount of detail into the actual conduct of the battle, but it also has got a lot of information about his career, and he does have a really fascinating story to tell across his entire career. So definitely keep an eye out for that. The Battle of Long Tan, the company commander's story.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.